"You think you can do something to me?" A white officer just punched an elderly black woman in the face in the middle of the street, assuming she was homeless. The blood from the blow hadn't even dried when 3 black SUVs pulled up. Seconds later, he went silent upon learning who she was. Don't look away, because what shook the entire city wasn't the punch. It was her identity. She didn't need to fight back, but he would never be able to look anyone in the eye again. Want to know what happened after that punch? Does this kind of thing happen where you live? Watch until the end to see whether justice still exists. Clarice Hargrove walked slowly along the stone-paved sidewalk of the downtown district, where government buildings stood tall like gray ice blocks. Her face showed no concern, only a calm firmness, as if she had seen this scene hundreds of times before. The morning rush crowd flowed past her like a current, and no one paid attention to the elderly woman crossing paths with hurried glances. Her hair was neatly tied in a bun on top of her head, her features clear like a silent declaration. Her light purple blouse caught the faint morning sunlight. No one knew who she was, and perhaps she never needed anyone to know. Inside the patrol car parked on the opposite side of the street, Nolan Briggs spat his gum out the window before starting the engine. The middle-aged man, with a shaved head and narrowed eyes, squinted as he saw Clarice step across the pedestrian line. A crooked smirk flickered across his lips, like a reflex when he saw something that disturbed his sense of order. He leaned over the steering wheel, wondering why an old black woman was lingering near the government zone, which he considered the police department's backyard. "What kind of old lady wandered into the government zone?" he muttered, loud enough to hear himself but quiet enough to dodge accountability. The sentence was aimed at no one in particular, but in his mind, it had already become a justification to act. Clarice stopped at the bus stop in front of the city courthouse. She checked her watch, glanced at the direction sign, then briefly looked toward the patrol car. Nolan had not taken his eyes off her. There was no suspicion in his look, only deep-seated contempt. His hand hovered over the horn, and the siren let out a sharp chirp, not deafening, but enough to make people nearby turn their heads. Clarice did not flinch. She turned to face him, her deep black eyes meeting the gaze of a police officer who had never learned to confront that kind of stare. Nolan stepped out of the vehicle, his broad shoulders brushing the curb, one hand resting on his belt. His voice rang out as if the entire street needed to hear what he was about to say. "Show me your ID. You're acting suspicious in a restricted area." He spoke in a tone he often used with people he believed had nothing to push back with. Clarice didn't answer right away. She opened her bag and pulled out an old ID card, its edges curled, but the name and citizen ID code still clear. She handed it to him without bowing her head. Nolan glanced at it, frowned slightly, then sneered. "This card's ancient. Who's to say it's even real?" He threw out the question with a smug grin, leaning in just slightly as if to reinforce the power imbalance. Clarice looked him in the eye, her stare unwavering. "You're abusing authority in front of someone you've never bothered to understand, and the most frightening part is, you think you're entitled to it." Nolan tilted his head, his lips curling like he had just heard a joke. "You trying to preach to me?" he said, shooting her a condescending glance. At that moment, she said nothing more. Her silence wasn't submission, but a mirror reflecting the emptiness behind the man's eyes. Clarice turned, intending to continue walking, but Nolan stepped in front of her. He blocked her path, one hand resting lightly on the gun at his hip, not to draw it, but to issue a warning. "Where are you going? What are you doing here? I'll need to run further checks." Clarice stopped completely, not out of fear, but as if she wanted to give him enough time to realize what boundary he was crossing. In her eyes, there was no anger, no panic, only something that made the man in front of her begin to feel smaller without understanding why. And Nolan Briggs, in that instant, had no idea that he had just walked into something far beyond protocol, something that would mark the beginning of a collapse. The siren blared again, cutting through traffic noise and footsteps, prompting a few bystanders to turn their heads on reflex. The patrol car pulled up closer to the curb, its tires scraping loudly against the dry pavement. Nolan Briggs swung the door open and stepped out, his boots hitting the ground with force as if to dominate the entire block. His voice came out from behind gray-tinted sunglasses, clipped and commanding like he was leading a roll call. Stop identification now! Clarice halted the moment she heard that tone, turned slowly, face unshaken. She did not step back. Standing tall, she reached into her bag and pulled out the same old ID card. Its corners yellowed, the paper wrinkled, but the print still sharp. It was the kind of card that had not longer issued for years, yet still was legally valid. Clarice extended it with her right hand, her eyes steady, her voice even and ancient in its certainty. You're confusing authority with the instinct to control. Briggs looked at the badge, then at her, then back at the badge as if trying to find a reason to escalate things. To him, calm was not permitted when he held authority. He inhaled, raised the badge close to his face as if scanning every line, then spoke with mocking disdain. Printed this yourself? I don't see any valid identification markers. His hand flipped the card over slowly, drawing out each second to reinforce his dominance over her. A middle-aged man walking by stopped in his tracks, unsure of what he was witnessing. A few others began to slow their steps. This is an administrative zone. Without official paperwork, I'm required to conduct a more thorough inspection. Briggs continued, his voice drawn out, eyes probing the space between that calm gaze. Clarice put the badge away, not hurriedly, not evasively, as if the inspection had only been a warm-up. You're trying to build a case. I'm just walking. That response, to someone else, might have seemed like defiant, but to Briggs, it was a quiet provocation. He leaned in, close enough that his shadow fell over half her body. The wind from the street corner blew through, creating a strange silence where one figure rested a hand on his holster while the other stood still, as if listening to a weather forecast. Talking doesn't mean you can go wherever you like, especially people like you. As Briggs finished, his eyes flashed with something Clarice had seen in years far older than his. That look needed no explanation. Its very presence was the accusation. She stared at him but gave no reply. Her silence didn't test Briggs's patience. It unsettled him differently. Serenity was something he couldn't command, and that shook him more than any act of rebellion. Clarice stepped back, not out of fear, but to remove herself from the reach of his looming posture. Briggs mistook it as a concession and followed with a growl in his voice. "Where are you headed? Got a purpose?" The question landed like it was meant for a suspect just detained. Clarice met his eyes and answered slowly. "You're investigating something you don't understand. You're about to cross a line you can't handle." The air around them thickened. Passers-by hadn't completely stopped yet, but several phones had started to rise. A young girl holding a camcorder tilted her head, quietly pressing record, and the first few seconds of the year's most explosive event were being captured in shaky frames from the palm of her hand. Briggs stepped closer, his head tilting slightly, eyes drifting from her face to her collar, and pausing at the hand holding her bag, as if scanning for any suspicious detail on someone he deemed unworthy of standing in a place he believed to be pristine. He let out a dry chuckle, not out of humor, but as a reflexive sneer, shaped by contempt. "I smell homelessness on you," he said, his tone light but laced with venom, not intended as conversation but as a label, meant to degrade, to define someone with cheap words. Clarice tilted her head slightly, her gaze steady and deep, and answered directly, without restraint. "No, that's the scent of fear coming off a man used to hitting women." For half a second, the air seemed to freeze, as if a part of the city's breath had been stolen. A young woman in a blazer walking by gave a glance and hurried her pace, unwilling to let her gaze get caught in the strange standoff. A boy riding his bike across the street began to slow down, trying not to stare but unable to pull his eyes away. Clarice did not move, standing still like a landmark in the middle of the sidewalk, refusing to react the way Briggs was used to from the people he stopped. That alone began to unsettle him. He was unfamiliar with stillness. He was used to avoidance, to submission, to fear of being wrong. Here, nothing followed the order he expected. He squinted, voice rising. "Do you have a criminal record? Ever been arrested? I have the right to check if I suspect abnormal behavior." As he spoke, he pulled out a small notebook from his pocket, beginning to scribble something. as if drafting a report that only he could understand. Laris exhaled softly, then replied, "Abnormal is when power sits in the hands of someone who cannot tell right from wrong." Her words needed no emphasis, each one driving straight into the arrogance Briggs wore like armor. He paused his writing, his eyes flashing with something sharper, no longer just arrogance, but edged with challenge. He disliked losing control, and now the unspoken shift in power was tipping him off balance. To assert himself, he stepped forward and jabbed a finger at her chest. "Don't think age gives you the right to be disrespectful. You don't even know who you're talking to." That line came out as if he had forgotten he was wearing a badge. Clarice stood upright, shoulders steady, eyes fixed on his hand without flinching. "I know. I'm speaking to a man about to learn the hardest lesson of his life," she said, then fell silent, making the air between them tighten further. Every word from that exchange was now filtering into the phone of a schoolgirl standing 10 meters away, her hand trembling slightly as she filmed, but the audio came through clear. People continued walking, but the flow had changed. Attention began to gather, not intervention, just quiet observation. Briggs hadn't noticed it yet. He glanced behind him as if looking for someone to back him up, then turned to Clarice with a face twisted by wounded pride. He yanked the notebook, scrawled a few more lines, then snapped it shut. "I have the right to search you if I suspect drugs or dangerous items," he declared in a voice that sounded like he was half-quoting a regulation he barely remembered. Clarice nodded slowly, not in agreement, but as if committing to memory exactly what he was about to do. "Then go ahead, but do it right," she said, brief and firm, locking eyes with him like she already understood the consequence of that choice. Across the street, a man in a security jacket began walking quickly toward them, a flicker of recognition in his expression. Change was beginning to stir, not from sirens, not from rank, but from the stillness of the woman standing in the street, unmoving, undeterred, and unmistakably unbroken. A man in a dark coat had just pulled his phone from his pocket but froze, thumb hovering above the screen. He stared at the scene before him, unsure whether to step in or remain where he stood. The elderly woman facing the officer did not yield, her gaze unshaken by shouting or by uniformed power. Something in the way she stood stirred a sense of unease in him, as though something more serious was unfolding beyond what eyes could immediately register. Clarice said nothing more. She stood tall, face composed, eyes fixed forward, as if intimately familiar with the scrutiny that repeated itself endlessly in daily life. But from where Nolan Briggs stood, irritation had evolved beyond attitude. It was now the frustration of losing total control. Briggs glanced at the person holding the camera, then shouted as if commanding an imaginary crowd, "No one is allowed to interfere. This individual is showing signs of resistance and disobedience." His voice was sharp, shooting straight into the ears of passers-by, as if he were trying to manufacture an emergency to justify what he was about to do. But every eye turned toward him not because they saw reason, but because they saw an uneven confrontation. A man in a white shirt had just stepped down from the bus stop across the street, his brow furrowed, hand still gripping the strap of his bag. He said nothing, but had already begun recording. On the gradually quieting street, phones began appearing as if by instinct. Briggs took a step forward, pulled a notebook from his back pocket, held it up to chest level, and began to read aloud. Full name, place of residence, purpose for being in this administrative zone. He recited it like reading from a script, each word deliberately trying to drown out the whispers that had started to ripple through the crowd. Clarice tilted her head slightly, eyes fixed on him, and enunciated each word clearly. "My name you already have. My address is irrelevant to justify walking on a legal public street. Purpose, I am doing what the law permits, being present." The response caused a few people to squint. The man in the white shirt cracked a tight smile, while Briggs gripped his notebook as if it were the last thing preserving his authority. His tone hardened. "You are obstructing a police verification process." Clarice responded, not louder but more clearly, "You are creating a process that does not exist." Briggs did not reply. Instead, he stepped closer, then turned to the people holding their phones and shouted, "Turn those off! You're violating operational rights." A few hands hesitated, but The schoolgirl near the lamppost kept her camera steady, her eyes not afraid, but as if witnessing something far beyond the scope of her moral education. Clarice glanced at the girl for a second, then turned back to lock eyes with Briggs. "You are doing something you'll later have to explain to a man in a suit, not a uniform." Briggs let out a guttural laugh, his hand tightening around his belt, eyes sweeping the crowd in search of a justifiable reason to end the spiraling confrontation. But what he failed to anticipate was that Clarice's silence did not create emptiness, it filled it with an invisible authority. Each word she spoke carried weight, overshadowing the hollow commands he was trying to bark. When he raised his hand again, as if preparing to move in, a man's voice rang out beside them, cutting sharply into everyone's awareness. "That's enough. You're crossing the line, Nolan." Every eye turned to the source of the voice. A security guard in a dark uniform from the medical center 2 blocks away stood holding his helmet, his face openly frustrated. His words shifted the entire atmosphere. Briggs turned, his face darkening, while Clarice showed no sign of surprise. She had heard those footsteps long before, and now everything had officially turned in a direction Briggs could no longer control. Nolan Briggs did not wait another second after the guard shouted in protest. He stepped forward, shoving Clarice hard on the shoulder, forcing her to turn and press up against the stone wall of the administrative building. The movement was neither gentle nor by any procedural training. Everything about it was raw impatience, simmering frustration, and a sense of power insulted by a woman he had never imagined could unbalance him. He dared demand to sum up. Clarice held her stance with both hands lightly against the wall, offering no struggle, no resistance, but also refusing to collapse into submissive silence. She turned her head slightly, voice steady and sharp as a blade slicing skin. "What are you exposing right now? Law or filth?" The atmosphere on the block tightened unnaturally, as if every stream of sound had been pulled away, leaving only the pressure building in the lungs of those watching. An elderly woman, pinned to the wall by the very person charged with protecting justice, had just asked the question that made every bystander question their silence. Nolan clenched his jaw, his cheeks twitching as if trying to swallow a curse. He began rifling through her bag, his hands rushed, careless and entirely unsupported by any stated cause. His actions were driven by frustration, wounded pride, and a need to fill the growing void in his control. Clarice allowed it, not from defeat, but with full awareness of what was being transmitted through each lens now fixed on them. His fingers dug through the side compartment, then the main one, searching for anything that could justify his suspicion, as if digging deep enough would uncover a mistake that could legalize everything he had done. She looked ahead, where a woman holding a child had stopped in the middle of the street, eyes wide open. A high school student whispered something to her friend, and both pulled out their phone. The girl in uniform at the corner held her phone still, its lens shaking slightly from her breathing, but the frame never strayed. Briggs panted after several seconds of rummaging, then pulled out a small notebook, a few folded papers, and a pouch of personal items. Nothing dangerous, nothing illegal. That only made him more irritated. He tossed the bag back toward Clarice, his voice scraping like a trowel on concrete. "What are you hiding? What document are you scared to show?" Clarice turned to face him, calmly adjusting the strap on her shoulder, each movement deliberate and composed. She did not answer his question. Instead, she looked directly into his eyes and spoke each word with clarity. "You're trying to prove something you don't even understand, and that's why all your reports read the same. Empty." Briggs hit a breaking point. He grabbed her arm, fingers tightening with force. But just then a loud voice called out from behind, "Take your hand off her." The security guard had stepped in close, his face stretched with tension, hand resting near his belt, but not drawing a weapon. He was not an officer, had no authority to intervene, but the sound of his voice made nearby onlookers take a step back. Briggs spun around, eyes wild, but before he could respond, someone in the crowd yelled, "I'm recording! Everyone can see this!" The loss of control was no longer internal. Clarice stood at the center, gaze fixed forward, an expression that made the sirens in the distance feel irrelevant. Briggs swallowed, his eyes sweeping across the people gathering around. For a moment, he was not a police officer. He was just a man standing in a crowd, gripping the arm of an elderly woman, with his every action being recorded on dozens of devices. Clarice turned slightly toward the security guard, then looked back at Briggs. "You've touched something many have tried to, but I've never let it happen twice." And with those words, for the first time, he let go. The schoolgirl adjusted her angle, still holding her phone as she began streaming live. Her first caption was typed quickly but with perfect accuracy. "Police officer assaults elderly woman in broad daylight." Just seconds later, a friend messaged the stream asking for the location and then shared the video on the school forum. On the edge of the street, more bystanders began to stop, their eyes darting from the officer rummaging through a bag to the figure of the woman pressed against the wall. Some quietly raised their phones. A few hesitated, but everyone sensed that this was no routine ID check. Briggs continued rifling through the bag, pulling out an old notebook with a cracked spine and a damp folded cover page. He flipped through a few lines, then raised the book to chest level as if it were irrefutable evidence. "This is the kind of junk addicts scribble nonsense in. There's no documentation here proving you belong. A dangerous vagrant." His voice grew louder, aimed not only at Clarice but at everyone watching, as if he were trying to turn the gathering into a miniature courtroom, where he was the only prosecutor. Clarice remained still, her eyes fixed on the words already etched in her mind since the moment Briggs touched her belongings. She had seen how those in power rewrote truth with the force of their voice. She had witnessed fear built from the most absurd foundations, just to justify a strike, an act of coercion. Clara slowly raised her hand, not to snatch the notebook back, not to deny the accusation, but to say, "Who do you call dangerous when all this old woman carries is a notebook?" The question required no rebuttal, but forced each listener to examine their perception. A young man standing nearby spoke softly, yet clearly enough for everyone to hear. "I once saw an old man handcuffed just for walking across the schoolyard." The air shifted. It did not provoke outrage, but sparked comparison. Briggs looked around, his eyes twitching slightly, then turned back to Clarice, as if waiting for her to do something that would justify his stance. But she didn't. She stepped forward once, closing the distance just enough for her words not to need repeating. "If you're trying to prove you're stronger than me, you're aiming at the wrong target. If you're trying to prove you have authority, then learn to understand the law." The wind swept down the street, carrying the sound of engines starting and birds calling from a third-floor balcony. But everything seemed drawn into one point: the confrontation between a man with a badge and a woman carrying a past no one dared measure. Fritz narrowed his eyes, shoved the notebook back into the bag with a resentful motion, then pulled out his radio and spoke into it in a flat tone. "Female subject, suspected of identity fraud, needs further verification, requesting support at Harrison Corner." That call for backup was unnecessary, but he knew that having more officers arrive would lend a greater air of legitimacy. Clarice did not react, her gaze shifting subtly toward the girl holding the camera. In that instant, a wordless recognition passed between them. She understood that what was unfolding no longer involved only her and the officer. Every action from this point on had exceeded the bounds of a personal inquiry. An elderly woman, forced against a wall in broad daylight, with countless eyes watching and cameras recording, was no longer a private matter. And on the other side of the live stream, viewers began asking, "Who is she? Why isn't anyone helping? Why is the officer so afraid of her gaze?" Those questions rippled outward like waves. Clarice remained where she stood, making no grand gestures, yet everyone was waiting to see what would break the false order Nolan Briggs was struggling to maintain. That moment, though no one knew it yet, was fast approaching. Briggs stepped forward once more, his face losing its coldness and shifting into obvious tension. The gazes around the street began to converge on one point, no longer scattered or tentative, but as if about to merge into a unified reaction. Clarice held her stare, not flinching for even a moment. The distance between them closed in an instant, and then, like an uncontrollable reflex or rage pushed to its limit, Briggs threw a punch with his right hand without warning, without any pretense of justification. The blow landed squarely on Clarice's cheek, producing a crack crack like something snapping beyond its limit. Those nearby gasped, an involuntary "oh my God" escaping as the atmosphere seemed to stagger. Clarice swayed and fell heavily against the edge of the sidewalk, her hand loosening and letting her bag drop onto the cement. A small drop of blood leaked from the corner of her mouth and spread across the bright purple fabric of her blouse. She lay there, eyes briefly closed, as if steadying her breath after the violent impact. The crowd thickened, many people already holding phones, but few could believe what they had just witnessed. The girl live streaming tilted her camera and murmured, "He punched her, right there on the street." Briggs stumbled back a step, his punching hand still tense. He panted, eyes locked on the woman lying on the ground, as if unable to believe what he had done. Several seconds passed before he snapped out of it and looked around, meeting a sea of eyes focused on him, not with fear but with expectation. No one rushed to intervene, but no one left either. That block of street was held captive by the punch itself, needing no barricades or sirens, only the blood on the mouth of a woman just struck by a uniformed officer. Clarice pushed herself up with her left elbow, slow but resolute. She did not wipe the blood immediately, instead planting one foot firmly to regain balance before sitting upright. Her face bore the swelling on her right cheek, the blood beginning to clot into streaks. But when she looked up, her eyes were clear. That gaze swept over Briggs, then the phones recording her, and finally rested on the security guard frozen at the curb. Briggs muttered hoarsely, "You fell on your own. I warned you, but you insisted." His words vanished amid the murmurs and a sneering laugh from someone behind. Clarice placed her hands on her knees and stood without waiting for help. Once upright, she pulled a tissue from her blouse pocket, wiped the blood from her mouth, folded it neatly, and slipped it back into her bag. Every movement was deliberate, so composed that onlookers almost forgot she was the one attacked. No one understood where her strength came from, but her calmness created a pressure heavier than any physical resistance. The live-streaming girl lowered her camera, still capturing Clarice's stern expression, along with a new caption. "She just got punched, and she's still standing." Rix gripped his radio tightly, pressing it to his ear like searching for something to hold on to. But even the signals through his earpiece could not help him regain control. Clarice met his eyes, speaking for the first time since the punch. "You just let your anger make your decisions, and now you will have to live with them." Her voice was not loud, but every listener sensed the depth behind it. It was a statement needing no explanation or correction, for the consequences had begun the moment his hand touched her face. The security guard pulled out his phone to call someone, speaking quickly but keeping his eyes on Clarice. The schoolgirl glanced around, then shifted her camera toward the gathering crowd. Moments later, messages began appearing on hundreds of phones. FBI. Who is she? Why didn't she fight back? He stepped away. The audience did not yet have answers, but everyone sensed this was no simple mistake. It was the first step in an unstoppable reversal. The live-streaming girl's shout sliced through the stunned silence of the watchers. "He just punched her! It feels like racial tears are tearing apart!" The words needed no analysis. They sent shockwaves strong enough that those hesitating immediately pulled out their phones, opened cameras, and aimed lenses at the officer standing in the street, his hand still bearing bloodstain. In an instant, the video spread, starting with a group of students and then adults who habitually scrolled social media. Clarice's face, lips still stained with blood, appeared on hundreds of screens within minutes. And what made them stop was not the blood. It was the eyes she opened. Clarice blinked once, then slowly lifted her head, looking straight into Briggs's eyes. There was no hint of defiance on her face, but something heavier than anger, an unspoken certainty. "This silence has brought down those bigger than you," she said. Not loudly, not forcefully, but leaving in the air a sound that made all the surrounding noise seem out of place. The person filming tightened their grip, mouth slightly open in astonishment, while the frame held her face steady. A wide stretch of street was now warped by that silence, where every breath, every subtle movement carried an indefinable tension. Briggs did not respond immediately. He stepped back, then glanced at the guard beside him, seeking agreement. But the guard stood still, eyes fixed on Clarice, silent and uninvolved. A crowd had formed like an unwilling audience. No one wanted wanting to witness violence, yet, once drawn in, no one could escape that role. Briggs turned back to her, his face beginning to lose its firmness. The chin that had once been raised now lowered slightly, and his voice shifted to a broken tone. "You are resisting an officer in the execution of duty. I will have to detain you for further investigation." Clarice stood upright, lifted her purse from the ground, brushed dust from her coat, then spoke evenly and slowly. "The only thing you are holding on to is an illusion this system once allowed. But its time has run out." Those words were not just for Briggs. They echoed down the street like a warning bell. The girl live streaming lowered her phone to her chest, eyes fixed on the image of Clarice. Comments began appearing under the video. Who is she? What will the police do next? Is she an agent? Whispers online turned into whispers in real life. As witnesses began to ask questions no one dared before. Briggs gasped, confused by the reaction around him. He turned, pulled out his radio, and called into the system. "I need backup at Harrison Street. There's a non-cooperative subject and a crowd is starting to gather." His voice faded as he realized every word was being recorded by more than a dozen phones nearby. Clarice stepped aside, opened her purse, and slowly wiped the swollen part of her cheek with a tissue. She no longer looked at Briggs. Instead, she looked into the camera of the girl filming and spoke clearly, each word perfectly timed. "I don't need to shout to be heard. They listen because they want to." The crowd did not applaud or cheer, but no one looked away. They stayed because something had moved beyond ordinary wrongdoing. They stayed because they saw in that woman something that made the uniformed man step back without daring to draw his handcuff. A young man with a backpack whispered to his friend, eyes never leaving Clarice, "I don't think she is ordinary." The other nodded, eyes widening. No one could identify her true identity, but everyone felt that Briggs had struck a crack he could not patch, and his blow was spreading like an unstoppable stain across the frozen gaze of an entire neighborhood. Jerome was standing guard outside the medical facility gate when he noticed an unusually large crowd gathering at the street corner. He had heard sirens earlier and assumed it was an ambulance, but when a young girl's shout rang out and people began leaning into the road to see, he sensed something was very wrong. As he hurried closer, he caught only a glimpse of Clarice struggling to stand, blood still smeared on her face, while Nolan Briggs stood panting, his hand still gripping the radio, not yet released. Anger surged within Jerome like a reflex, not because he knew the elderly woman being attacked, but because he had witnessed similar scenes as a security guard at a psychiatric hospital years ago, where the vulnerable were treated as if they had no value. "Nolan, who did you just hit?" "She is," Jerome's voice boomed, thick with an emotion difficult to name, turning the entire crowd around. Briggs spun toward the voice, eyes wide in recognition and fleeting confusion, quickly replaced by a defensive attitude. "Step aside, Jerome. This doesn't concern you," he said without daring to meet his gaze. But Jerome stepped forward, brushing Briggs's hand aside and looking at Clarice a few steps away. Her face remained calm, but her eyes were wet, not from pain, but as a reflection of deep disappointment. Jerome approached her, examining the swollen bruise and the small tear at the corner of her mouth, then whispered, almost choked, "Are you okay?" Clarice nodded slightly, saying nothing more. Briggs grabbed Jerome's sleeve, forcing a harsh tone to regain control. "I told you, she is being held for investigation. You have no right to interfere." Jerome spun, face inches from Briggs's, chest heaving. "I'm not interfering, I'm reminding you who she is. You just touched someone you shouldn't have." The crowd murmured. An older man behind them muttered to himself, "Looks like he knows her. That remark sparked a chain reaction. The live stream shifted angle. A social media account typed a new caption. "A stranger just confirmed her identity? An agent?" Briggs took a step back, eyes scanning around as he began to see what he had previously dismissed, the collective gaze no longer on him. He reached again for his radio, but Clarice spoke up. "He is not interfering. He is witnessing. And from now on, everyone will be a witness." Her voice was low but steady, cutting through the crowd like a signal to end the excuses that were about to be made. Jerome nodded, pulling out his phone to dial. He did not say who he was calling, simply recited a string of numbers, then said 3 words, "Activate emergency mode." The other end did not question. A beep confirmed the call and ended it. Briggs began to panic. He looked at Clarice, then Jerome, then at the crowd now pressing in around the corner. He stammered, "She's not wearing any badge, I couldn't tell. I thought she was an imposter." But those words no longer reached anyone. Clarice pulled a small item from her blouse pocket and held it toward Jerome without raising it high. He inspected it carefully, then nodded. It was a metal badge, about the size of a cigarette pack, engraved deeply with the words Federal Bureau of Investigation. Jerome turned to face Nolan Briggs directly. "Now, do you know who you just hit?" Briggs recoiled a step at the sight of the small object Clarice handed Jerome, but only for a moment. Suddenly he pulled his baton from his belt, a familiar motion from a man more used to threatening than protecting. The crowd hissed softly, some startled, stepping back another pace. Under the slanting sunlight filtering between buildings, the dark metal glinted before being gripped firmly in his right hand. Briggs crouched slightly, stepped back with his left foot, preparing to swing back, though it was unclear at whom. He growled, his voice losing all pretense of professionalism, "One more word, and you'll be lying next to her." The threat was aimed directly at Jerome, but it did not make him step back. The guard carried no weapon and held no rank high enough to stop a mid-level officer, yet he stood there like a barrier between two opposing forces. Without blinking or breathing heavily, Jerome looked Nolan Briggs straight in the eye, then shifted half a step forward as if any wrong move could push everything over the edge. "You don't know who she is yet," Jerome said in a low voice, solid and steel-like, "but you will remember this name for the rest of your life." Briggs's expression changed. His eyes widened. The hand gripping the baton remained steady, but the grip weakened. That statement was not a warning, but the conclusion of an unspoken sentence. Clarice stepped forward, still clutching her purse. She stood behind Jerome, needing no effort to push forward, yet drawing the atmosphere toward herself. She said nothing, and that very silence made those involved more uneasy than any accusation could. The girl live streaming held her breath, stepped back a few paces to widen the frame, the camera trembling slightly but never losing focus. Online viewers kept increasing, comments flooding in. "Don't tell me she's FBI. Who is backing her?" And "This is no longer just an ID check." The whispers online became whispers on the street, as witnesses began to ask questions no one had dared before. Briggs still held his baton, but his other hand started moving toward his radio, as if to call for backup again, or simply to hold something against the emptiness. He stammered a few meaningless sounds, eyes darting around, then snapped in a harsh tone, "She could be anyone. I don't need to know. I'm following protocol." His words were swallowed by the rising wave of doubt. A man on the sidewalk chuckled, then clapped slowly. The steady applause echoed, drawing the attention of others nearby. No one joined in, but no one stopped it either. Jerome turned to Clarice, eyes asking if she wanted to say more. She tilted her head slightly, then looked toward Briggs, this time not with a correcting gaze, but as if looking at someone who had just lost everything. "Do you know the one thing you cannot do?" she said in a low, steady voice, each word striking like a hammer on wood. "You cannot pretend you never acted, and you will not escape that because your eyes do not see it, but everyone else's eyes do." Briggs gasped, then dropped the baton to his belt. The small click of the latch was soft, but enough for the girl live streaming to lean in closer. An undercover agent, standing unnoticed at the end of the street all along, stepped toward Clarice. He wore no black suit or sunglasses, just an ordinary man in a gray jacket. But as he approached, he pulled out a badge and held it up without explanation. "Agent Hargrove, command has acknowledged the signal. Intervention order activated." The crowd held its breath. Briggs froze, about to speak, but his lips stiffened. The protest died in his throat, along with the sound of grinding teeth and a chill running down his spine. Clarice looked at him, nodded slightly, then turned back to face Briggs. "Now you know who you just aimed your baton at," she said, her voice low and chilling. "But this is not the end." Those words, along with Jerome still standing guard, made the whole street freeze freeze for 3 heartbeats, and on the live stream corner someone had already started typing the first line of a story no one dared imagine would come true. Clarice stepped back half a pace and lightly rested her hand on Jerome's shoulder for support. Her body still swayed slightly from the punch, but her gaze had returned to a cold calm. Blood trickled from the corner of her mouth, sliding down her chin and staining the darkened purple collar of her blouse with a spreading red blotch, yet she made no effort to wipe it away. She stood up without assistance, legs steady despite having just endured a full-strength blow from a man in uniform carrying the authority of the law. A few people in the crowd tilted their heads subtly, while an older woman gripped her grandchild's hand tightly, perhaps to keep the child from rushing into the street. They did not know who this elderly woman was, but seeing her neither shouting nor calling names, nor pointing fingers, they began to realize the figure before them was not easily defined. Clarice adjusted her bag slowly, like someone arranging orders before facing a tribunal. Her face bore no hatred, yet those watching sensed that anyone who had crossed this line with her would pay in some way, at some time, even if no one ever declared it aloud. The girl live streaming held her breath, moving the frame closer to Clarice's face. Her hair remained neatly tied up, though a few strands had loosened at the temples. The bruises on her face were clear, but her gaze was sharp, like a cutting lens. In the slanting light of the late afternoon, she stood in the street, not overshadowed by badge, weapon, or title. The only thing that made no one dare speak against her was the way she carried her weight amid all the absurdity exposed on the street, like a misframed painting. Someone in the crowd whispered, "I've never seen anyone get punched and then stand like they're starting a meeting." Briggs dared not step forward. His hand slipped from the radio, his head bowed, but his eyes darted left and right as if searching for an escape route. Without attracting more attention, Clarice turned, no longer turning her back to him, her eyes stripping away the false cloak of power he wore. "You just attacked someone. You don't have the rank to question," she said in a voice neither loud nor angry, yet each word forced Briggs to breathe harder, as if knocked off his feet. A young reserve officer arrived at the scene, thin and youthful-faced, but already visibly shaken. He looked at Clarice, then at Briggs, his arm pressed close to the holstered gun but not drawing it, eyes flickering to the woman's bloodied lips before retreating, unwilling to insert himself into a confrontation where rank, courage, and understanding far exceeded his grasp. Clarice remained still, facing Briggs. Those watching the live stream saw the running caption, "What did she just say?" followed by, "He doesn't have the rank." Briggs could not respond in time. He looked at her and stammered almost inaudibly, "She's not wearing a badge. I'm following the procedure." Clarice raised her head, glanced past him toward the girl filming, then locked eyes with Briggs. "You're not following procedure. You're following a habit." Those words reflected directly back at his face, where no determination remained, only the sediment of a man used to abusing privilege without ever being challenged. Sirens began sounding in the distance, but no one moved from their spot. Clarice, amidst all the tension ready to explode, held her ground, as if the coming storm had nothing to do with her. Yet everyone knew, when she turned and walked away, that would be the moment a series of doors would open, but not for those standing behind her. The reserve officer was very young, his face dotted with sweat despite the absence of harsh sunlight, and at first his eyes looked at Clarice with nothing but confusion. But when he saw the metal badge Jerome handed back to her, the fog in his eyes vanished, replaced by unmistakable shock. He stepped back half a pace, glancing at Briggs as if searching for an explanation. Then his lips moved to utter a sentence no one dared say in the middle of a crowded street. "Nolan, she is an agent." That voice was not just a personal realization, but a final confirmation, forcing any remaining doubters to face reality. Briggs heard the words, but said nothing. He turned to Clarice, eyes wide open, yet finding no rebuttal. No one cared anymore whether he intended to continue the interrogation. All attention now focused on the moment he stepped back. One step, then another. Those nearby witnessed the trembling in his hand holding the baton, fingers turning pale from gripping too tightly for too long without release. In the thick silence that swept over the scene, the sound of his shoes striking the pavement echoed clearly with each step. An officer, retreating before a woman who had just been struck, was a picture needing no narration. It spoke for itself. Clarice held her gaze steady, refusing to follow. She did not need to chase anyone in a victory that required no force. Jerome stared at Briggs, eyes fixed, even though his body remained still. The girl with the phone kept recording every frame, from the hand holding the badge to Clarice's steady eyes, Briggs's pale face, and finally his retreating feet. Comments flooded the live stream non-stop, each line a gasp from thousands of places, but all sharing one emotion, utter disbelief. FBI, that cop's finished. She hasn't even finished speaking, and he's already shaking. Briggs lowered his head, eyes avoiding Clarice, then suddenly raised his radio to his ear, voice mumbling, no longer as firm as before. I request another unit to take over the scene. Situation beyond my authority. Please confirm. He ended the sentence not with a full stop, but with a fragmented silence. That message was not for his superiors, but for everyone around him, an admission that he had crossed a line and no longer had a safe retreat to preserve his old image. Clarice's expression remained unchanged. She lowered her hand, put away the badge, then gently turned toward Jerome and softly asked, "Is everything clear now?" Jerome nodded, looking at her with eyes both relieved and tense, as if awaiting the next sentence. But Clarice said nothing more. That silence cut like a long wound, causing no bleeding but forcing everyone to reflect. Briggs finally turned and walked back to the patrol car, shoulders slumping like armor removed. His polished shoes hit the pavement heavily, as if dragging behind them a shattered system of belief. The reserve officer stayed where he was, hands in pockets, eyes following Clarice as if witnessing a living lesson unfolding before him. The girl filming lowered her phone after more than 10 minutes of non-stop recording, sighed softly, and whispered, "I didn't know who she was before, but now everyone does." Clarice looked at her and nodded slightly, saying nothing more. In the street, people began murmuring more, not to gossip, but to confirm to each other that they had witnessed something impossible to ignore. And Clarice Hargrove, though the blood on her lip was not yet dry, had crossed a boundary no one dared approach before. She did not need to speak further, because the man who stepped back had said it all for everyone. Clarice turned slowly. Each movement weighted as if it carried its gravity. Her face bore fresh bruises, a swollen purple chin, but her eyes never once flinched. Amid the busy street where the faint hum of traffic drifted in from afar, she faced Nolan Briggs, the man who had punched her down onto the sidewalk without ever verifying her identity. She did not raise her voice. The words she spoke were sharp and cold, cutting through the falsehood like a small knife. "You just attacked someone you don't have the rank to question." Briggs stood frozen, eyes fixed on Clarice as if recognizing something that had never before existed in his mind. He was used to swinging his fists at those who could not fight back. He was used to shouting at those without any protection. But in that moment, on the government street before dozens of cameras and eyes, he suddenly felt small before the woman who lifted her head, blood still staining her collar, yet her gaze remained as sharp as steel. The reserve officer beside him held his breath, as if unconsciously relearning a long-forgotten lesson in ethics. The live stream, flowing with thousands of comments, was suddenly interrupted by panicked exclamations. "Not enough rank? What rank is she? How can a cop dare act like that?" No one focused anymore on Nolan Briggs's uniform or badge. What they saw was a man shrinking inside a collective awareness that he had crossed a line, not of authority, but of ignorance shielded by a uniform. Clarice took a step forward. When people fear losing their place, they tend to act before understanding who they're facing. She continued in a calm, measured voice, each word sinking into attentive ears. "You think you're in control, but you don't know where the system truly places people." Briggs's face twisted, his right hand curling behind his back as if trying to grasp something, but in that tense air he could pull out nothing but the crowd's focused gaze. Jerome stood behind Clarice, arms crossed, eyes fixed on Briggs as if ready to step in at any sign of escalation. But Clarice would not allow anyone to interfere. She wanted the man who acted to face the consequences directly, without any intermediaries. A child, standing at the roadside, tugged on her mother's hand and whispered, "Why does she talk like she's judging someone?" The mother shook her head silently, but never looked away from Clarice the entire time. Briggs forced a bitter smile, eyes darting for an escape route. He said, almost hissed, "I'm just following protocol. If you don't comply, I have the right to detain you." The word sounded weak, carrying no weight next to the glaring truth. Clarice lifted her bag gently, brushed her fingers over a torn seam caused by the earlier punch, then raised her head. "If you think power lets you use violence first and think later, maybe you're not fit to wear that uniform another day." A black SUV stopped at the end of the street. The door swung open and two plainclothes agents stepped out, moving without haste but scanning the scene sharply. One nodded at Clarice, confirming an unspoken order, then strode straight toward Briggs. The other stayed behind, pulling out a phone and beginning to film the entire scene. No shouts, no commands. Yet their arrival felt like a final seal on a truth Nolan Briggs could no longer escape. Clarice did not look back. She met his gaze one last time, then walked past without another word. He stood there, arms hanging loosely, mouth opening and closing, his whole body seeming to collapse inward beneath the scorching pavement. In that moment, he knew he had hit the wrong person, and this time the cost was not a warning, it was a career, a sentence he had written with his very first punch. Briggs stepped back once more as the black SUV stopped at the end of the street. He turned to the reserve officer as if seeking backup, but the young man stood still, eyes lowered, showing neither support nor opposition. For a brief moment, Briggs realized he was alone amid the crowd of witnesses, with no one foolish enough to side with him. Suddenly he shouted in a strained voice, the words echoing off stone walls like a desperate blow. "I don't see a badge. I thought she was an imposter." That explanation was swallowed by the silence. It did nothing but draw the contemptuous glances of a few onlookers. Clarice heard every word, but did not react immediately. She merely turned her head, her gaze scanning every detail of his face, as if inspecting a false testimony. Then she stepped forward, moving gracefully despite her still healing wound. Each step narrowed the space between the woman who had been struck and the man who struck her, as if the gap was shrinking to hold only a final judgment. Clarice stopped close enough that Briggs had to step aside, unable to bear the pressure of her presence. Her voice came softly, almost a whisper, yet thick and heavy like cold stone pressed against his back. "Attackers often mistake their victims for invisible." Briggs opened his mouth to respond, but the words struck him like a blow without a hand, cutting off every justification. She did not use power to force, nor call witnesses. With just that sentence, Clarice placed him exactly where he always placed those weaker than himself. Jerome stood nearby, expressionless, but with eyes locked tight like a bolt on a door. He did not intervene because Clarice knew exactly what she was doing. Dozens of eyes in the crowd had ceased curiosity and shifted toward silent admiration. The girl live streaming lowered her phone, stopping the recording, because everything that needed capturing had been captured. Every fact, every glance, every word. None could be erased. Before them stood an elderly woman with dried blood on her collar, causing a police officer to shrink back like a student caught unprepared at the front of the class. Briggs looked once more toward the SUV, eyes almost pleading, then toward the vehicle, as if hoping someone would interrupt Clarice. But those who stepped out merely observed. They did not intervene or issue orders. Their presence was not to rescue him, but to ensure that this time everything followed the proper procedure, not the smooth words he once used to cover his wrongdoing. Clarice looked at him, then down at the baton still marked by sweat in his hand, and back up. She did not smile or sneer, simply looked at him as one would a decayed symbol. Have you ever looked at the person you're about to strike and asked if they have a family, a dignity, or a reason to remain silent? Her voice held no sadness, only the weariness of someone who had seen this happen too many times. You think you're in control, but what you control is an illusion, and now it's collapsing right here on the sidewalk. A child in the crowd suddenly asked her mother, Why isn't she afraid of that officer? The mother squeezed her child's hand but said nothing. Clarice looked at the child, then bowed slightly as if to say that courage is not in fighting back, but in knowing who you are and making others recognize that. And Briggs, for the first time in his life, faced someone he could neither deny, push away, nor control with law, force, or shouting. Clarice had done what the entire system he relied on could not, forced him to see himself naked in the middle of the street. 3 black SUVs silently turned onto the main road as if prearranged, their movements so smooth the crowd on the sidewalk heard no brakes. The doors opened simultaneously. 6 plainclothes individuals stepped out, none resembling bodyguards or intervention officers, but every motion carried the precision of a well-trained force. Their silence was the clearest sign of a high-level intervention that no local police dared interrupt. Briggs instinctively straightened, blinking rapidly as if trying to convince himself this was some mistake. Yet the cold stride of the team leader, along with his knowing glance that needed no confirmation, made Briggs clench his fists, sweat dampening his back. Some in the crowd began to step back, making space, not out of fear, but sensing they were about to witness the conclusion of something long overdue. The man leading wore a dark gray jacket, his face emotionless. He approached Clarice, pausing with a slight nod that confirmed her rank to the witnesses, then turned to Briggs. His voice was steady, every word clear and weighty without emphasis, pressing down on the atmosphere. "Agent Hargrove, we have taken over the case. This individual is suspended immediately." His eyes did not leave Briggs, and the brief statement ended, all the control the sergeant had clung to for so long. Clarice stood still, eyes fixed on Briggs as she heard those words, not because she needed confirmation, but because that was the final order that officially removed Nolan Briggs from the ladder of power he had once likened to a royal decree. The girl filming restarted her camera, this time silent, capturing the face of the man who had shouted and brandished his baton, now fading visibly, lips pressed tight with no words left to argue. Briggs was speechless. He stammered, eyes searching for someone to explain what's happening, but everything was already clear. He raised his hand, voice half defiant. "I'm carrying out my duty. I was not warned about—" The man interrupted, voice no louder but resolute. "You acted before verifying identity. You distorted the entire procedure with emotion and contempt. The case is under federal investigation. All your statements will be recorded." Those words, in the street, before dozens of witnesses, carried the weight of a preliminary indictment. A member of the agent team quietly stepped forward, placed a file envelope before Clarice without explanation, knowing she understood its contents. Briggs stood frozen, his neck tensing, eyes bloodshot, but no one cared how he felt, because the woman he had struck was now the center of power in the case he had abused. A mother in the crowd picked up her child and left, but looked back once, her gaze silently conveying thanks. Others said nothing but remained, understanding they had just witnessed a rare moment in life, a victim assaulted on the street, standing tall. Clarice, her voice steady and low, said, "I will not let this go. And I hope you know, there is only one way to fix a mistake, and that is to face it head on." The man nodded, extending a hand to escort her to the vehicle, but Clarice did not move immediately. She looked back at Briggs one last time, her eyes filled with pure disappointment, a disappointment reserved for someone who thought power was a weapon, but failed to see that arrogance was what destroyed him. Long before the first punch, only 4 minutes after the first clip was posted, the sharing wave began spreading like spilled oil. More than 10,000 shares were recorded across platforms, each one a voice, pushing the story far beyond the limits of a small street. The hashtag Clara Still Standing quickly appeared. At first, a few captions from those present, then a wave of support from accounts everywhere. In less than 10 minutes, that hashtag became a symbol for what the community had long whispered: resistance through courage intelligence, and blood. Local news channels started sending reporters. A journalist from WSKT pushed through the crowd, set up a compact camera, and began filming on site. But by then, the central figure in every lens was no longer Clarice Hargrove. It was the man standing opposite her, hands locked in steel handcuffs, collar askew, forehead dotted with sweat. Nolan Briggs, the sergeant who had shouted before the crowd and struck an elderly woman, now stood motionless like a stone statue, eyes fixed on the littered, dusty street where power had once cast a large shadow over him, but was now dissolving without a trace. Clarice stood not far away. She watched silently, as if seeing off a ghost who had sown injustice in the name of justice. Her face still bore bruises, the dried blood at the corner of her mouth a thin, dark layer, but her eyes shone brighter than ever. She did not need to step forward. She had stood from the start, and the whole world was confirming that all at once. Briggs lowered his head, his final glance before being led away by the agent directed at Clarice. It was neither a plea for mercy, nor regret, nor hatred. It was emptiness, as if he no longer recognized the image he once carried, as if he watched his ego shatter, piece by piece, with every click shared across social media. The sound of handcuffs clicked again as the agent tightened his grip and pulled him through the street. The crowd fell silent, no shouts. That silence was the first form of justice Clarice reclaimed, through the firm stance of someone who had never bowed. The waiting SUV's rear door opened as Briggs was gently pushed inside. An elderly man nearby muttered, "How many years did it take for her to live in peace, and only 5 minutes for that guy to bury himself?" Others said nothing, only looked at Clarice with eyes completely different from before. The girl live streaming, hands still shaking but lips pressed tight, typed into the caption, "She doesn't have to shout. She just stood there, and now the whole country knows her name." Below, thousands of comments poured in. One wrote, "This should be in textbooks." Another commented, "Clarice stood there not for herself, but for those who never had the chance to stand." Each line peeled away another layer of the false shell, worn by those who once claimed the right to life and death in uniform. Clarice quietly turned to the nearest agent and asked, "When can I resume my work?" He nodded. "As soon as you are ready." She looked back at the crowd, eyes sweeping over every face, then bowed slightly in greeting. No speeches, no public support needed. She left, leaving behind a stretch of street once overwhelmed by darkness, now illuminated by truth, steadfastness, and a living symbol, Clarice Hargrove, still standing. The headline appeared almost simultaneously on multiple major news outlets. FBI agent assaulted in downtown street. Images extracted from the viral live stream were broken down frame by frame, putting Clarice Hargrove's face on the front page of at least 8 newspapers within less than 2 hours. Local television interrupted programming to broadcast a special report, replaying the moment Sergeant Nolan Briggs threw the punch at the elderly black woman, then pausing on her unwavering gaze, an expression that rendered all justifications meaningless. Political commentators wasted no time. One spoke on air. This story goes beyond violence. It touches the fear that the black community has lived with for decades, being seen as a threat before being treated like human beings. Social media exploded with heated debates, yet one thing everyone agreed on was Clarice Hargrove's composure, symbolizing a power that could not be suppressed by force. Reporters scrambled to reach her, calling federal agencies, even tracking down places she had worked. Former colleagues described her as a sharp, critical thinker, rarely speaking publicly but leaving a lasting impact wherever she went. However, all received the same response from Clarice. She declined to comment, refused interviews, and stayed away from cameras. The only person authorized to speak on her behalf was a senior aide from the Washington office who stood at a quick press conference and said just one sentence before leaving the podium. "Clarice Hargrove does not represent pain, she represents order." That statement spread within minutes, shared alongside images of her standing in the street, dried blood on her lips, calm eyes steady. Doubters immediately fell silent. No one debated why she was at the government district that day, or why she remained silent so long after the incident. All attention focused on the message. Order does not come from those who carry guns, but from those who refuse to bow to chaos. In a cafe 2 blocks from the FBI headquarters, 2 young students switched on a large screen to watch the live news. One whispered to the other, "If she had yelled, no one would have cared. But because she didn't need to yell, the whole country has to listen." The other nodded, eyes fixed on the screen, where the anchor emphasized that Clarice had refused all legal funding, demanded no compensation, and filed no personal lawsuit. She only requested that the entire internal investigation process be made public. Jerome, the security guard at the medical center who had once blocked Briggs's baton swing, was also invited for an interview, but he said only one thing: "I did not stand up because she is an agent. I stood up because I knew she was someone we were not allowed to let fall." That statement was clipped into a separate excerpt, attached to the end of news reports as unedited closing remark. The next day, Clarice left the headquarters alone, without an escort. She carried no files, her bruises mostly faded, holding only a small notebook. She walked through the streets as on any other day, neither holding her head higher nor stepping faster. Yet everyone passing by paused for a moment, their eyes following her. In that definition, Clarice Hargrove was no symbol of victimhood, but the voice of an order being restored in a world gone astray. The digital forensics department of a major television network quickly took action. Within 3 hours, they released an analysis of the entire live stream video spreading online. No edits, no cuts, no added effects or audio manipulation. Each frame perfectly matched the original data, capturing the precise timeline from the first second Briggs sounded his whistle to the moment Clarice raised her head and spoke her last sentence before he was handcuffed. The authenticated report was sent directly to federal internal agencies and simultaneously posted publicly on the platforms of 3 television stations. It was irrefutable evidence, a clear boundary between truth and all attempts at justification. In the newsroom of NTV, a young female reporter put on her headphones and rewound the video for the 6th time. She sat at the edge of her seat, left hand gripping her notebook tightly, right hand paused mid-line as Clarice's face appeared on screen, absorbing Briggs's punch. The whispers behind her suddenly stopped, no one telling anyone else, yet everyone focused intently on the eyes of the elderly woman, eyes that did not retreat, did not panic, but seemed to look straight through a crumbling system, cloaked in justice. The next moment was when Clarice spoke. Her words came softly but coldly, cutting through the dust of an era like a blade. The reporter blinked repeatedly, then removed her headphones and wiped her cheek quickly. Behind her, a colleague quietly asked, "Are you okay?" She did not answer immediately, only stood up and stared at the screen before her, her lips pressed tightly. Then her voice cracked, but was clear enough for all to hear. "I used to think I was strong, but she is still." Those words were heard by a nearby editor, recorded, and later quoted in the main commentary of the evening program. They were neither embellished nor edited, preserving the original emotion as spoken. The broadcast at 10 p.m. attracted 3 times the usual viewers. Clarice did not appear live, but her face filled major headlines alongside the young reporter's quote, a true statement from a real person at a moment when the whole country watched. Soon after, journalism schools began including the clip in teaching materials on media ethics. They did not focus on news structure, but taught students how to distinguish between a story to exploit and a truth to protect. A veteran lecturer told the class, "We may write hundreds of reports every day, but there are only a few moments when your conscience must rise. This is one of them." At the FBI headquarters, a closed meeting took place in a room on the 12th floor. Everyone who had supervised Clarice directly for more than 30 years was present. They did not meet to defend her or offer testimony. They simply reviewed the entire video, every word, every action, every breath held. When it ended, the head of the room said, "She does not need our defense. She sets the standard herself." That statement ended the meeting. Everyone left without further discussion. They knew that from that day on, Clarice Hargrove was no longer just an agent. She was the silent answer to an era of violence disguised in uniforms and laws. And in a small office at the end of the second-floor hallway, the young reporter returned to her desk, reopened her notebook, and wrote a new line beneath the old notes. "Silence can break, but dignity cannot." She put down her pen, looked at the screen, where Clarice still stood, centered in the street, eyes as sharp as steel, making everyone step back, not by force, but by undeniable presence. The closed meeting room on the 8th floor of the NYPD headquarters was packed with seats, fluorescent lights casting a harsh glare over the long table where a line of mid- and senior-level officers sat side by side. No press, no recordings, only thick briefcases in front of them and attention stretched like a taut wire over the past 2 days. The clip of Clarice Hargrove's assault had become a blind spot that all official statements avoided. Yet behind this door, simmering conflict had reached a breaking point. A group of lieutenant colonels, mostly white, sat together near the head of the table. Their voices were clear and firm, demanding to protect the force's image, warning against an uncontrolled incident damaging the entire department's honor. One of them slammed his hand on the table, voice sharp. "Briggs is one of us. Mistakes happen, but hanging him out to calm public outrage is unacceptable." Scattered nods followed. Familiar phrases surfaced: work pressure, real-time judgment calls, uncooperative suspect. But this time not everyone remained silent. At the far end of the table, a young officer with only 3 years in the force stood up. His uniform was still crisp, his badge freshly sewn, but his eyes never blinked as he spoke. "If the force protects itself with punches, then this uniform isn't worth wearing anymore." His words echoed through the quiet room, breaking the unspoken code of silence that had shielded many in murky situations. Some turned to look at him, some eyes mocking, others concerned, but no one interrupted. That courage, even from a newcomer, made those seated reconsider their tone. The captain, at the center of the table, rested his forehead on his hand, then lowered it slowly, looking long at the young officer. He said nothing to contradict or praise, only set down his pen on the unfinished minutes and exhaled, "We are under scrutiny at every step, not because of the job we do, but because some don't understand what we represent." The meeting continued with a cooling of the atmosphere. Arguments gradually shifted focus. No one dared emphasize protecting colleagues anymore. Discussions turned toward reforming internal oversight and establishing an independent response team for serious complaints. An older lieutenant spoke slowly. "It's not Clarice Hargrove who hurts us, it's Briggs, who damages the voice of every person trying to do right." Outside in the hallway, a group of office workers overheard snippets of the leaked conversation through the door crack. They said nothing, only exchanged looks before glancing at the internal bulletin board, displaying photos of officers awarded the previous year. Briggs was among them. One person removed his photo, folded it, and quietly placed it in a file envelope, sealing it again with clear tape. Clarice's story did not just ignite the media. It cut to the core of a system built on secrecy. The appearance of an older black agent assaulted in broad daylight exposed not only abuse of power, but also peeled back layers of a structure that had long treated wrongdoing as an occupational hazard. Now no argument could ignore that punch, and the young voices, like the officer who spoke up, began to ask, "If we keep silent, when will the uniform we wear truly symbolize justice instead of concealing power?" In the meeting room, the final minutes were signed without a single line proposing protection for Briggs. The meeting ended with a silence heavier than when it began, but somewhere a movement had begun within the organization itself, and the name Clarice Hargrove, though absent from the meeting, became the catalyst, forcing the system to confront itself. The next morning, an internal letter was sent directly to the inboxes of police chiefs and federal investigative offices. Sent from Senior Agent Clarice Hargrove's office, the subject was simply capitalized on silence and responsibility. No greeting, no closing pleasantries. The text was no longer than one page, but each sentence forced the reader to face hard truths. "I stood in the street," she wrote, "and I was not surprised to be attacked. I was surprised that the silence around me was louder than the punch." The next passage was even more direct. "It is not the errant officer who endangers justice, but those within the system who choose to remain silent. The silent within the system are hidden criminals." The words were cold, neither pleading nor angry, but struck with the force of a hammer on the table where many had once thought themselves properly seated. The letter spread internally at lightning speed, no one daring to deny its impact. Some tried to argue it was too harsh a criticism, but most who had served with Clarice over the past 30 years knew she did not write to impress. She wrote because every prior warning had been ignored. Within hours, administrative control offices began receiving urgent directives from higher authorities. A closed-door meeting was convened between representatives of the Department of Justice, the Federal Ethics Oversight Office, and the Department of Homeland Security. The official interagency investigation was activated within 36 hours after the incident, faster than any prior internal abuse of power case. The chair of the Federal Oversight Committee briefly stated, "We are no longer examining the fault of one person. We are reviewing how many like him the system has let slip through." Clarice's office was placed under special protection, not out of concern for her safety, but because she had touched a deep layer many had tried to keep intact. Fellow agents assigned to support the investigation agreed she needed no legal representation. Clarice continued working daily, taking no leave, reviewing old files, and checking operational routes in high-risk areas. She made no public statements, but within the system, each of her actions compelled those in office to reflect on themselves. A deputy director, who had been her superior for 8 years, when asked if Clarice intended to indict the entire force, replied, "Clarice does not work to condemn others. She simply refuses to accept the existence of half-measured justice." That statement was recorded in internal minutes as an admission from the heart of a system under the microscope. At local units, junior officers began requesting retraining on civil rights and civilian engagement procedures. Some civil organizations immediately voiced support and proposed cooperation. The atmosphere was not stormy, but a heavy silence, like metal preparing to shift. Clarice was not the one to ignite the explosion. She was the one to keep the flame burning steadily. It was that persistent weight that caused layers of dust long settled on the corridors of power to begin to be swept away. In her office, Clarice looked out the window as midday light shone on a wooden desk piled with unresolved files. She did not look at her phone nor answer any calls. Only one notebook lay open, where she was writing the next line after the letter she had just sent. A single sentence. "The true testimony does not lie in reports. It lies in what we have chosen to keep silent." Thousands gathered in front of City Hall on Saturday morning, holding handmade signs, some printed large, all carrying a common, clear message that needed no explanation. Justice for Clarice is justice for all. The crowd did not chant slogans loudly, but walked in unison through the main streets like a quiet, unstoppable wave. People who had kept their distance from protests were now present not out of anger, but because they felt they were standing at a moment where silence was an act of complicity. At the intersection of Main Avenue and 8th Street, a small wooden stage was set up where civil rights representatives took turns speaking. An older man wearing a dark coat slowly walked up to the podium. His face was lined with deep wrinkles, his silver hair combed back, but his eyes were still sharp. His name was Leonard Davis, a former NYPD officer who had retired early after more than 20 years due to pressures that couldn't be documented in a report. The microphone picked up his slow but clear voice. "I used to dream of someone like her daring to stand," he said, his voice not loud but drawing everyone's attention. "When I was in the force, every wrongdoing was wrapped up with vague reports and clever statements. We knew it, but we bowed our heads, thinking no one could stand against it. Yet she stood in the street. No need to call anyone, no need to hide behind a title. She stood, facing the blows, and let the whole country see that no one should act like the law is theirs to wield." The applause started sparsely but soon became thick, steady, not loud but enduring. Leonard took a deep breath, stepped back from the microphone, and looked toward a photo hanging on the side of the stage, where Clarice was captured in the moment she stood up after a punch, her head slightly tilted, hair still tied back, eyes looking straight ahead. A group of law students from Columbia University stood in a line on the sidewalk, wearing white armbands with Clarice written on them. They didn't speak, but each held a public copy of the technical report on the original video, handing them out freely clearly to anyone who wanted to read, to know exactly what happened instead of relying on the edited versions circulating online. For them, this action was a way to protect the truth without relying on symbol. A 12-year-old girl stood beside her mother, holding a sign written with a marker, "She's like my grandmother." Many paused for a moment, then turned away. No one spoke, but something hung in the air, making even those who had never been interested in politics understand this was no longer an isolated incident. In a high-rise apartment, far from downtown, Clarice Hargrove watched the march on her computer screen. She wasn't logged into social media, nor did she make any calls. She just sat in front of the screen, holding a steaming cup of tea. From the apartment, the sunlight poured onto the light-colored tiles, casting its glow on the desk where her open notebook from the previous day lay. Clarice leaned over and added a line to the margin of the old page. "Justice does not seek the crowd. It seeks the person who dares to stand before the crowd without needing applause." Outside, the crowd continued to move. They knew that as they walked, a system was being forced to reflect itself in the light that Clarice had just turned on. And in every step, there was not just support. There was also a reminder for those still in uniform that silence in the face of wrongdoing was a betrayal of the very oath they had sworn to protect. In the 2 weeks following the incident, invitations poured into Clarice Hargrove's office. Civil rights groups, organizations, universities, and even a federal commission expressed a desire to hold a public tribute. With live media coverage and prominent speakers, the schedule attached to the invitation included an award ceremony, testimonies from witnesses, and even a performance reenacting the moment Clarice was attacked and then stood up in the street. The planners all believed she would be touched by the strong support from the community. They thought that after so many years of quiet service, she would agree to step onto the stage to receive the deserved spotlight. But her response was always the same: short, to the point, without elaboration, no negotiation, refusal. One government assistant, calling for the final persuasion, was told clearly, "If I needed applause to be recognized, I would have chosen a different profession." That statement was never recorded in any speech, but it began to spread internally among those who worked with her, not as a proclamation, but as something understood by anyone who thought of Clarice. In her 30 years of service, she had never accepted any personal accolades. There were years when her name was nominated for the Distinguished Service Medal, but she quietly withdrew from the final list. What she chose to leave behind were handwritten case files of cases that hadn't been tried fairly. A former colleague recalled that when Clarice broke up a major human trafficking ring in the Southwest without firing a single shot, her superiors suggested a public press conference to enhance the image of the force. She responded, "I'm not a representative, I'm a tool of execution." The way she lived, the way she handled her work, was always this clear. No ambiguity, no image building, and she never allowed herself to become a symbol for others to create and then praise from a distance. Even now, when her name appeared widely in the media and on platforms, Clarice still arrived at the office on time, personally checking the files and directly contacting the young agents in training. She never mentioned the incident. She never commented on public reactions. Those who entered her office felt one thing clearly: she wasn't being elevated into a symbol to be used as a political tool. She maintained that boundary with her quiet refusal. A seasoned reporter once knocked on her office door, bringing a draft article for the Women Who Changed America section. He made it clear that Clarice could refuse to speak, but at least allow her name and image to be used. Clarice gently placed her hand on the open file in front of her, looked at him, and replied, as if talking to the file, "If I wanted to appear on the front page, I would have chosen a different profession." The reporter left her office without offense. On his way back, he opened his notebook and quickly wrote a line. It's not that she doesn't want to be seen. She just wants what's deserved by justice, not what's pleasing to the public. Later in the published article, he didn't use her name or images, leaving only that closing statement. And it was Clarice's refusal of all honor that tied her name to a concept clearer than any medal. She didn't represent victory, she represented principle. In an era where everyone wants recognition, she chose to be the person who didn't need to prove herself. And because of that, every eye still followed her, not for the glory, but because she was the living proof that integrity exists amidst chaos. 4 days after the march at the Central Square, the Joint Investigation Office received a brown paper envelope marked "To the right person." Inside was a handwritten letter in blue ink, shaky but legible. The writer was a 38-year-old woman named Althea Coleman, currently living in a resettlement area in the South Bronx. She had once worked as a server in a small restaurant less than 10 blocks from where Clarice Hargrove's incident occurred. The letter was submitted with a copy of a medical report from 5 years earlier, along with a police report that had been rejected for lack of evidence and unreliable witnesses. The letter opened with, "I never thought I'd dare to speak about that, but after seeing Mrs. Clarice stand up after the punch, I understood that silence does not bring me peace." In the letter, Althea described an incident when she was 33 years old, being asked by a police officer named Nolan Briggs to leave the restaurant area while on her way home. She did not resist but was shoved against a wall and then struck in the stomach, requiring a 3-day hospital stay. Her husband notoriously kicked her in the stomach, requiring a 3-day hospital stay. At the time, her complaint was dismissed due to no video evidence, and Briggs claiming she showed signs of disorderly conduct. She wrote, "I also stood in the street, but I had no badge, nor did anyone live stream." Upon receiving the letter, the head of the investigative team ordered a full review of all Nolan Briggs records from the past 10 years. The results were unsurprising, but plunged the group into prolonged silence. A total of 4 complaints had been filed, 3 by women of color, the other involving a young man with intellectual disability accused of obstructing public traffic after wandering into the government district. All 4 cases were closed without prosecution. The case of the young man, Lester Ramos, age 22, drew particular attention. In the old investigation report, Lester was described as uncooperative, but his mother, Maribel Ramos, had camped outside the police station for 2 nights, demanding camera footage. She was denied because the area was not under surveillance. At the time, no one believed a mother saying her son was simply trying to get home from the library. He returned with a broken arm and was unable to speak for 2 weeks. Clarice had heard of this case but was not assigned to it. Now, she requested the team reopen all related files. Meanwhile, news agencies began digging up old articles previously sidelined to the back pages. Bronx woman restrained by police for unknown reasons. Young man with disability detained in public. Each headline now served as clear evidence of a pattern, not random acts but repeated motifs involving vulnerable subjects, insufficient evidence, and silence. A member of the Joint Investigation Team quietly said during a closed meeting, "We are not just investigating one assault. We are opening the door to a vault where mistakes were thrown and locked away." The resurfacing of these long-forgotten cases shattered the system's old facade. This time, with Clarice's presence, every prematurely closed report, every name, every bruise, every person denied justice for lacking a badge or title, resurfaced as a reminder that justice cannot depend on chance. Though Clarice had never spoken publicly, those harmed by the same hand understood her act of standing up that day was not just for herself. It was a test forcing all wounds hidden for years to be reevaluated in the light of day. In the closed-door meeting between the prosecutor's office representatives and the Special Investigative Unit, Clarice Hargrove sat upright, hands clasped in front of her, her gaze unwavering even as 6 people in the room waited for her confirmation. A senior officer asked, "Do you wish to file a separate suit as a victim?" Clarice didn't answer immediately. She slowly opened her notebook, flipped through a few marked pages, then closed it and set it aside. Her voice was low and steady. "I don't want to prosecute for myself. I want to do it for them." Silence stretched for a few seconds. Federal prosecutor Fiona Lang, known for her cold principles and a trial record few could rival in cases of powerful criminal figures, gave a slight nod and turned to the clerical team. "Start compiling a witness list. Not just witnesses from the incident on May 11th, expand to the reopened old cases." A clerk looked up and asked, "Including complaints that were dismissed 5 years ago?" Fiona responded quickly, as if the answer had already been decided. "Include them all. If anyone has ever written Nolan Briggs' name in a complaint, we need to reach out." The investigative unit, in coordination with the prosecutor's office, began narrowing down all individuals who had ever submitted statements or left records, not only with the NYPD, but also at community checkpoints, regional health centers, and civil organizations. A separate data system was established to consolidate matching records. The name Nolan Briggs appeared more frequently than they had expected, especially in areas overlooked by the media, where residents still often believed that speaking up only brought more trouble. Within 3 days, they found 12 individuals who had had negative encounters with Briggs. 8 of them had filed reports, but never received any response. One of them was a janitor at a public library who had been searched by Briggs during a night shift. Another was a retired bus driver, once forced to stop mid-route for an attitude check. Each story, no matter how small, carried the same undertone: abuse of authority happening when those being controlled had no one to back them up. Clarice did not directly interview them. She requested that all data be recorded, stored, and backed up in at least 3 copies, but refused to interfere with the testimony process. "I'm the reason these files were reopened," she said, "but I mustn't be the reason their statements get skewed." Prosecutor Lang understood that. She arranged the meetings in private settings. No press, no cameras, only a shared commitment. Each person coming forward would be treated as a real witness, not just a name buried in a report. At the same time, Clarice did something few people knew. She hand-wrote letters to each individual on the witness list. No templates, no computer printouts. Each letter included a short but weighty message. "Thank you for not erasing the memory, even when the whole system once told you to." An elderly woman, upon receiving her letter, called her son, who lived in another state, and told him about the incident she had kept silent about for over a decade. The son cried upon learning what his mother had gone through, and that very call brought another new witness onto the list. Clarice didn't want a trial that sparked a wave of temporary outrage. She wanted a chain of truths, not to expose one man, but to force the entire system to face what it had ignored. And with each person who spoke up, the witness list was no longer just a legal record. It became a quiet answer to the question Clarice had once asked on the sidewalk: law or cruelty? And this time, justice didn't get to choose silence. The courtroom was kept closed during the initial hearing. He sat on the left side of the wooden table, the overhead light shining down on his buzz-cut scalp dotted with sweat. His face was expressionless, neither showing emotion nor bowing his head. In the first 18 minutes of questioning, he had not uttered a single word. All communication came from his defense attorney, a tall man with salt and pepper hair, who continually interrupted the prosecutor with standard phrases meant to delay. "My client declines to give testimony at this time. We request a postponement of the confrontation to conduct an independent psychological evaluation." Prosecutor Fiona Lang looked up at him, then directly at Briggs. "You are here not because you lost control, but because you exceeded your authority by controlling others." The lawyer immediately objected, demanding the insult be noted. The judge remained silent for a few seconds, before saying, "The court acknowledges the request for evaluation, but the process will not be halted." At the same time, Clarice Hargrove appeared at the side entrance, accompanied by protective agents carrying a thin file. When asked if she wished to submit a detailed report, she nodded and withdrew a handwritten statement from her jacket pocket. The A4 paper was folded in half and written in blue ink with firm handwriting. The court requested that it be read aloud before sealing the file. "On May 11, I left the Federal Security Research Center to go to the administrative district according to my schedule. En route, I was ordered to stop, interrogated, and then assaulted. The perpetrator was Sergeant Nolan Briggs, not authorized to conduct federal-level searches. His actions lacked a legal basis. I request prosecution to protect the dignity of those who have been disbelieved." That was the entire 7 lines. The courtroom fell silent after the clerk finished reading. The statement was placed into a yellow folder and handed directly to the judge. Briggs remained seated, eyes fixed on the table. For the first time during the investigation, he did not look at Clarice. It was the posture of a man who once believed he controlled the situation, now exposed by silence itself. His lawyer leaned over and whispered, as if repeating a prior agreement. Briggs did not respond. He seemed to understand that all delaying tactics could not erase those 7 lines. They were concise, but enough to make old punches come alive as undeniable evidence. In the hallway after leaving the courtroom, a young agent turned to Clarice and asked, "Why didn't you say more, give details, or request a sentence?" She stopped at the stairway, looking down the corridor where light filtered through a narrow window onto the gray stone floor. "Because everyone already saw. I don't need to describe what they witnessed. I only need to confirm that it happened." The court continued its legal process, but no one on the investigative team still saw this as merely an assault case. It was a reckoning of a system that had allowed victims' silence to be ignored and attackers' arrogance to be justified by uniforms. In that setting, between stone walls, Clarice maintained her resistance. No raised voice, no self-praise, just letting the truth come first. Everything else she left to the court and time. When the final words in her statement ended, the clerk glanced at Clarice, waiting for a sign to speak more or stop. Clarice only nodded slightly. The courtroom felt wrapped in a heavy fabric of what no one dared voice, not because she was an agent, not because she was punched in public, but because throughout the questioning, she never framed herself as a victim. Clarice stepped down slowly from the witness stand, walked toward the table without looking at Briggs or glancing at the silent officers by the wall. When a reporter called out from the hallway, "Do you feel hurt?" she stopped, did not turn, and answered clearly, each word striking like a hammer on heated metal. "I am not hurt. I am made clear." Those words struck the courtroom ceiling, falling over robes, lingering on cold floors and rustling papers. An officer on the prosecution side, silent in prior closed sessions, lowered his eyes, clenched his fists, and said nothing. He had reassured himself that he was not involved, that Briggs's actions did not represent the whole force, that staying out was his way to remain neutral. But at that moment, hearing a woman punched in the street declare she was not a victim but fully seen for the first time, he realized that neutrality was a cheap mask for complicity. Fiona Lang scanned the room, then signaled her assistant to collect the files. The trial would move to open testimony in 7 days, but no one needed to wait to understand what was happening. Since Clarice entered the court with no private lawyer, no press release, no public symbol, she had broken everything the justice system relied on to build its image. She did not need defending, she only needed to be truly seen. Leaving the court, a young internal observer followed quietly, asking, "Do you think Briggs will be convicted?" Clarice did not stop, answering near the steps, "The right question is not whether he will be convicted, but how many once saw him as justice." Those words made the young man pause, not for their weight, but because they were unavoidably true. As Clarice exited, a cold air swept down the hallway, carrying an unshakable silence. The door behind her closed softly, but its echo sucked sound from the room. In those seconds, both those standing for justice and those hiding behind the law knew nothing would ever be the same. They had just left a room where a woman, once beaten, had forced everyone to reconsider why they stood where they did. That final silence was no longer avoidance, it was acknowledgement. No one dared deny what had happened. Thus, Clarice's words needed no repetition. They were loud enough to survive without ever needing to be heard again. The federal court read its verdict on a Friday morning. Before the first rays of sunlight touched the west window of the courtroom, the room held no more than 30 people, but the tension made everyone feel as if hundreds of invisible eyes were watching from everywhere. Nolan Briggs was led between 2 escorting officers. He remained silent, head slightly bowed, shoulders slumped, as if his body had already accepted the punishment before the court spoke. The judge was concise. She flipped through 3 pages of documents, reading each word clearly. After reviewing the evidence, witness testimonies, the victim's statement, and the history of complaints regarding abuse of power, the court sentences defendant Nolan Briggs to 10 years in prison for assaulting a federal agent, accompanied by 3 years of mandatory supervision post-release, including bans on contact with law enforcement agencies, use of weapons, and compulsory participation in a 2-year ethics retraining program. No one reacted. The room felt suspended in a thick moment where all emotion was sealed. Briggs raised his eyes upon hearing 10 years, but said nothing. He glanced across the room to where Clarice Hargrove sat, calmly, her face unreadable, hands folded neatly on her lap, gaze steady. He found no triumph or satisfaction in her, only a firm presence enough to make him realize that all these years the power he had abused had always faced a limit he never recognized. As Briggs was escorted out, someone quickly removed his nameplate from the security console by the back door. A young communications staff member bent over to type a quick update, though there was nothing sensational to write. Everything had become clear. From the moment Clarice stepped onto the street that day, the Ruth had begun to be recorded, line by line. The court sentence was not a climax. It was the final period of a story everyone had to see through. That same afternoon at the city police headquarters, Police Chief Leonard Pike submitted his resignation. No press conference, no long statement, just a sealed envelope left on the secretary's desk, labeled with his name and date. Inside was a brief note. "I take responsibility for the system I once led." The letter was sent directly to the mayor, and within 4 hours, the personnel office announced acceptance. No objections, no defenders. His silent withdrawal was like an indirect admission. Leonard Pike had been the one who appointed Nolan Briggs to the city patrol unit. Now he ended the vicious cycle he had let persist for too long. Clarice did not appear at any meetings after the trial. She made no comments about the sentence and did not respond to reporters. She returned to internal work at the Federal Coordination Office, continuing to review files from units showing signs of abuse. No photos of her have been released since the verdict. Yet, in a few brief statements on civil rights forums, Clarice Hargrove's name still appeared with a simple message: no one starts a battle for fame. People do it to end a long-tolerated wrong habit. With the closing of the final trial, the so-called power of a man who once used his fists instead of reason was swept away like dust from the steps of justice. No one needed to praise him. No applause was required. What mattered was recorded fully in the verdict, the resignation letters, and the lingering silence within the hearts of those who witnessed it. After the verdict, the ripple effect extended beyond Briggs. A lengthy internal list surfaced naming those who had indirectly supported, covered up, or deliberately ignored warnings about his behavior. Each had appeared in briefings, shared laughs with him on patrols, and dismissed his controversial acts as minor. Now, they faced urgent reassignments or internal investigations. No press conference specified who was held accountable, but the list was not kept secret long. Within 48 hours, at least 5 officers were temporarily suspended and 3 others reassigned out of the city. Among them was Lieutenant Doran, who had dismissed the first complaint from a black woman threatened by Briggs the previous year. Doran was not fired, but transferred to a northern town with no major precinct, no rank, and little to boast of. A quiet cleanup that saved face. Inside administrative offices, many old files were reopened. Reports were cross-heckered against videos, complaints, and supplemental testimonies. Documents, once folded away for lack of evidence, became undeniable proof of a culture of cover-up. Hallway talks no longer revolved around promotions, but about who would be named next. No one sat comfortably in chairs that once made them feel invisible. The system did not collapse. Police stations stayed lit, patrols ran the streets, and orders cycled through radios every hour. But the veneer of an organization proud of discipline and unity began to crack visibly. Whispers and sidelong glances among colleagues became proof of a truth no one dared say aloud. Trust in the motto, "Stand together, sort right and wrong later," was fading. Young officers who once stayed silent to avoid conflict began filing detailed reports, scrutinizing street actions more carefully, and staying longer after meetings to ensure nothing was missed. A young sergeant named Malik said in a closed meeting, "I don't want to call this punishment, I want to call it awakening." The remark was not recorded but spread quickly among teams. Some nodded. Others quietly rose before questions could be asked. Outside, public opinion split. Some demanded conscience, others demanded accountability. Yet both understood that this time, the system could not treat the matter as an isolated case. to bear it. And as everything continued to operate, those once part of the power machine began to realize that its workings now came with closer scrutiny from both the public and insiders. Clarice Hargrove never publicly singled out individuals. She did not need to. Her actions, her steadfast silence, and timely words forced the system to face itself, not with anger, not with tears, but through cracks no diplomatic language could hide. Because a system does not need to collapse to be exposed. It only needs to begin cracking. Everything else follows inevitably. Clarice Hargrove left the old neighborhood on a calm, windless morning. She told no one, left no messages, no goodbyes. Neighbors only discovered the apartment was empty when a delivery person arrived and found a single note taped to the door. No new address, no recipient's name. Inside, the scent of her presence lingered. Old books, the wool sweater she often wore on late nights writing reports. But now everything was cleared out. No traces left except the light spilling through the window where she used to sit and watch the street below. No one knew where she went, only a photo circulated quietly like a secret guide. In the picture, Clarice leaned slightly, her hand resting on the shoulder of a brown-skinned girl with curly hair, her smile bright like a light turned on in a scene once shadowed by darkness. That girl was the first to livestream the incident. She didn't know who Clarice was when she started filming, only that she was witnessing something wrong that needed recording. Now, in the moment they stood side by side, there was no story of power, no identity, no court, just the connection between two generations, one who stood tall amid the storm and one who dared to hold the camera when no one else dared to speak. The caption alongside the photo was as simple as Clarice's departure from her old home. She used no flowery words, no grand appeals, no calls for change, just a short sentence, typed clearly on a white background. Strength is not in the punch, but in the stand. 7 words, no more, but like a precise touch on the deepest memory of the community watching the case from the start. Within 3 days, that phrase was shared more than 1 million times. There was no viral hype, no paid ads, no media campaigns, yet each share came with a personal note. A mother recounting when her child was threatened at school, a man recalling his silence on a subway when a person of color was questioned unfairly, a student posting a photo of her grandmother writing, "This is who taught me not to bow my head when someone yells." That phrase infiltrated hundreds of Facebook walls, thousands of private messages, and appeared atop countless untitled emails. Each share was a recognition that somewhere in this busy, conflicted life, there remained space for quiet persistence and a chill-inducing subtlety. Clarice made no further comments. She did not reappear. No new photos surfaced. Every post mentioning her came from others, but in every retelling no one called her a victim. They called her the awakened one, not because she shouted in the street, but because she stood firm, both literally and figuratively. No one knew where she lived now, but where she last appeared was no longer a physical place. It was a consciousness. Someone once asked on a social forum, "Why is she smiling in that photo?" The answer came from a person who never met Clarice but watched the entire live stream and followed every trial, because she knew that after all, what's worth remembering is not the pain she suffered, but the eyes of that girl, once scared, now daring to look straight into the camera. Some still expected Clarice to speak again, to write more, or to appear on television to recount everything. But when what needed to be said was spoken at the right moment, the silence that followed became the most important part of the story. A woman did not need to remain present to prove she was right. She had left, leaving behind the hardest thing to erase, a standard. No one can fake the steadiness in each step or replicate a gaze both cold and piercing like a sharp blade. That is something no one can perform. And so, that photo, along with the 7 words she left, became the final milestone in a series of actions needing no fanfare or backing team, yet powerful enough to shift the perspective of an entire institution accustomed to sirens and commands. Clarice Hargrove left no monument, but she left a way to walk, to face, to see, and in her silent departure, many began to learn how to stand without waiting to be struck awake. at an officer training school deep in the southern suburbs. The projector's light reflected off the white wall of a small classroom, fully equipped with recording cameras, microphones, fixed seats, and an electronic board. During a training session on ethics and situational response, a video was played, now familiar to millions, starting with a siren blaring, a figure in a purple shirt slowly walking along the sidewalk, followed by the close-up capture of the strike from a cell phone held by a young girl standing among the crowd. The instructor remained silent for the first 2 minutes, letting the silence serve as the sole introduction. When the clip ended, showing Clarice being punched down onto the sidewalk and Nolan Briggs' gaze fading away, he turned off the projector and stepped forward. This scenario is included in this year's curriculum as a standard test of ethical awareness in law enforcement duties, he said slowly, yet firmly. Among the young trainees, most had never been to a real scene, and no one spoke up. Then a hand rose. A thin, light-skinned man around 23 years old asked directly, "If she wasn't an FBI agent, would this even be discussed here?" The room fell silent. The question was quiet, but landed like a challenge to the collective silence that swallowed all cases where victims lacked status for the story to be told. The instructor straightened, exhaled slowly, then answered, "Then she would be dead, or lying in a hospital under a name no one bothers to ask, and the video would be buried under familiar blame." No one argued, no forced smiles, no one avoided the truth just spoken. Clarice had never agreed to teach in classes like this. She had received many invitations from police academies across the United States, asking her to recount the event as a vivid example. Some even prepared scripts, invited media to accompany, ready to edit footage to elevate her presence as a symbol of female empowerment, people of color, or nonviolent resistance. But she declined them all, not out of avoidance. She knew if a video could teach more than a long speech, then she did not need to stand on a podium. And if they truly wanted to understand what happened, they must learn to be silent and listen with awareness, not applaud a hero. The instructor's response that day, though never officially added to the syllabus, became the most quoted phrase throughout the course. It was called the 17th question, recalling the moment when all distance between theory and reality was stripped away in 30 seconds. After that session, trainees began asking more questions. They started discussing power, misrecognition, boundary violations, and consequences, not always loudly, but no longer indifferently. Another female instructor, who once worked in the internal complaints unit, told her students that in her 10 years of teaching, she had never seen a video quiet the classroom so completely. "I've shown the Rodney King case, used Minneapolis, but when it came to Clarice, the students didn't just watch. They began questioning where they would stand in that situation." Outside, Clarice's clip kept spreading. No algorithm boosts, no extra commentary. Because her refusal to appear and her silence let the video speak, it became the clearest action. She did not teach classes, but she was present in every lesson. She did not tell stories, but her story echoed in every confused gaze of the new trainees. And if anyone thought an FBI agent being assaulted was unusual, they misunderstood. The only abnormal thing was that she was still alive, forcing people to reconsider how they used uniforms, violence, and prejudice as tools to control reality. Clarice wrote nothing after the final photo, but in an internal group chat among instructors, one former Justice Department employee quoted her words from a closed meeting last year. "If anyone asks why I haven't quit the profession, I say because I've never seen anyone dare touch the stain and remain clean." No one responded, because by then everyone understood that Clarice never needed to stand on a high platform to create change. She only needed to be present at the right moment and leave silences no one dared erase. The events surrounding Clarice Hargrove unfolded in a setting contrary to what is usually reserved for a figure who shook the system. She did not appear. No one dared turn her into an empty symbol. Because of this, insiders understood that what truly bore Clarice's name began appearing in documents, meetings, and draft proposals without needing her image. In the City Law Enforcement Reform Council's report of over 80 pages, Clarice Hargrove's name appeared exactly 3 times. Not bolded, not specially marked, but those 3 times were placed at key points: the beginning, middle, and conclusion. Early on, her name was cited as an indirect influence on the wave of investigation investigations into internal abuse of power. In the middle, it was used as a prime example of how one solitary act can trigger a chain reaction throughout the entire force. At the end, she appeared in a single framed line as a reminder. She does not speak much, but everyone heard clearly. The report writers added no praise. They kept a calm tone, like Clarice's silence in the video where she was attacked. Her existence did not come from tragedy, but from the aftermath of exposed indifference. At the Reform Council headquarters, in the 9th floor meeting room, one chair remained empty for 3 consecutive weeks. It was reserved for the position Community Representative Overseeing Internal Reform, a new role created after pressure from civil groups and independent media. The first nominee was Clarice. The proposal passed unanimously at the first vote, with no opposition. Clarice declined. She sent no letter. She simply delivered a small envelope to an old lawyer's office, inside which was a handwritten line. "I was not born to fix their mistakes. I was born to remind them who was forgotten." The lawyer read it repeatedly, then placed the letter in a desk drawer. A week later, the council kept the seat empty as an unnamed symbol. No one was allowed to erase the first name ever nominated. Clarice Hargrove's name remained there like ink that never fades. In several other high-level meetings, people began referring to Clarice as an unrepeatable case. They tried to explain why she refused the seat, why she needed no titles, and why she did not use influence to campaign or seek publicity. Some thought she feared politicization. Others believed she was still shocked. But one former assistant gave a simple answer. She knows when enough is enough. No further explanation needed. In reality, Clarice's story did not end with a grand reform. It seeped into internal memos, new training sessions, and officer education excerpts. She did not appear to confirm anything, but those who faced the consequences of silence learned to listen to those who never spoke. Each time an instructor mentioned her name, no one laughed, not out of fear, but because no one wanted to repeat the fate of one who once despised silence. Nolan Briggs, now only a file number, nothing more. A small Brooklyn paper once ran a single article on Clarice, without headlines or images, just a brief commentary. It ended with, "In a system used to shouting and overwhelming orders, she chose to remain still and let others hear the touch of truth." And strangely, everyone heard it. That line was captured and quietly shared like Clarice's first video. It accompanied the photo of her smiling at the livestream girl, the only public appearance she allowed after the incident. Clarice never let anyone speak for her. In the end, she needed no credit. She knew that if she left behind a chain reaction strong enough to make people look inward, she needed no council seat, stage, or award. They only needed to remember the moment they fell silent for someone who did not, and that moment said it all. The NYPD headquarters building retained its old concrete gray, but inside, the hallway on the 6th floor showed a clear gap in the row of medals displayed. The name Nolan Briggs, once a sergeant commended for handling emergencies in dangerous areas, had disappeared from its carefully framed plaque. That name had once been polished with photos from ceremonies and brief statements, but was erased by an internal decision requiring no press conference. All of this happened after 2 closed-door meetings, 2 undisclosed emails, and a signing session among 3 authorized officials. Those who knew the reason for the removal did not bother to explain. Those who did not know dared not ask. That silence was enough to affirm that justice this time required no justification. Conversely, within the FBI's internal data system, where thousands of behavioral records are stored, the category Standard Conduct when Facing Out-of-Control Situations was recently updated with a new subject, Clarice Hargrove. The brief description read, "Subject maintained stable response, prioritized order and psychological crowd management despite being assaulted irrationally, facing violence, and lacking peer system support." That is how the FBI classified an agent who did not use weapons, did not shout, did not retaliate, yet caused the entire system to adjust afterward. No wording was softened in that update. Everyone who read the file understood that sometimes the most proper conduct comes from the one being attacked. not the one giving orders. At a Brooklyn dispatch station, where nightly shifts repeated with calls, collisions, and exhausting administrative reports, a young officer arrived for his early shift. Tall, youthful-faced, slightly withdrawn after transferring from a precinct unit, he looked at the whiteboard right outside the public service room. Usually it held reminders of rules, shift assignments, or weekly cautionary quotes. But today, in the upper left corner, a message written in black marker, slanting slightly but clear: Clarice still stands. No one knew who wrote it, no date accompanied the phrase. The young officer intended to erase it and write the new shift schedule, but his hand froze. He looked at the words again. The word stands was not just about physical posture. It was a way of affirming something never denied, but always needing repetition. He put down the pen, turned away, and wrote the schedule on a separate taped paper. From that day, each shift group saw the phrase and left it untouched. Some started to rewrite it in neater handwriting, but stopped halfway. Perhaps they realized that if someone was brave enough to write it amid an environment where honor often followed rank, keeping it as is was a necessary acknowledgement. Clarice never knew about that phrase. She did not return to any station and did not follow hourly news updates. She lived in a small wooden house on the outskirts near the state border. Her routine was steady. No interviews, no ceremonies. Yet strangely, her presence was heard everywhere. In rookie police training, instructors used her video as an introduction to lessons on ethics and authority. In misconduct hearings, commanders referenced the Hargrove situation as a milestone to remember, and in internal reviews, simply calling the victim by name was no longer a technicality. It was a step in determining whether staff genuinely cared about the consequences of their actions. A veteran officer who had worked in 3 states, written dozens of investigative reports, and lost faith in systemic change, told his trainees, "I once believed this system was unfixable. Then I saw an old woman with no weapons, no power, who still caused the whole system to stop and look again. I don't need more winners. I only need more people who stand." The class was silent. Those hearing that statement did not take notes, but remembered it as a new definition of effective resistance. The phrase, "Clarice still stands," lasted for 3 more months. It was neither erased nor replaced. One day, someone added beside it in red ink, "And what about us?" 2 questions, side by side, no answers. But it made many pause longer before the bulletin board that usually held only temporary notices. Clarice's impact was not an explosive wave. It was a slow aftershock, seeping into cracks never regarded as problems. Her presence was not on TV or in honorary portraits. It was in people starting to erase unworthy names and keep small words strong enough to remind a whole system that someone once stood still, got hit, then stood up again, taking nothing away except the quiet dignity of being heard. The street remained long and narrow, still carrying the smell of exhaust mixed with dust from nearby shops under renovation. But today, Clarice Hargrove did not walk it as an anonymous shadow, nor did she carry the anger of someone once struck. She moved as if no punch had changed her face, as if her gaze from that day had not left marks on every corner, as if the silence she once embraced had spread enough to slow the rhythm of injustice. And no sirens, no calls to stop, no one shouted for her papers. With every step, she knew the city had changed, not because she tried to fix it, but because it was ashamed to exist alongside her. Along the sidewalk, vendors set out plastic chairs, pastries, and small milk boxes for children just released from school. When Clarice passed, they neither clapped nor called her name nor lifted cameras. They simply stood and bowed their heads slightly, not out of fear, but understanding. The people who once watched police press her against a wall now lowered their heads for one reason. They owed her a respectful glance, not because she was an agent, but because she had been beaten on this very street, and the way she rose made the whole city bow. From the old wooden chair of the roadside bookseller to the wall still stained where she fell, everything seemed awakened as her figure passed slowly. A little girl ran out of a small shop, crumbs still on her hands, eyes wide as she looked at Clarice. She looked at her like a character in a book, though no photo bore her name on the cover. The girl whispered clearly, "Are you still an agent?" Clarice stopped, bent down to the girl's level, eyes calm without arrogance. She did not say she was retired, did not mention her tenure, nor that the title had cost many their jobs. She just smiled and answered, "I am still a person, still able to see who must be stopped." The answer made the girl furrow her brow, as if trying to grasp something too big. Then she nodded, as if understanding that being human was a longer task than any title, and that the ability to see wrong never required a badge. Clarice gently stroked the girl's hair and continued walking. Every house along the street kept a piece of that collision from years ago. The wall where the first camera captured her being punched was now covered with children's paintings of justice. A barber shop displayed an article quoting, "I am not hurt, I am made clear." Even the bus stop where the live streamer once stood held a small sign, "Look closely before judging." Clarice did not stop anywhere. She let her eyes pass over these details like a mother watching her child grow without a word. At the intersection of two streets, she paused briefly. The scene was quiet, but not empty. She was no longer alone. The loneliness that once surrounded her when she stopped on that road had been replaced by a different kind of space. The space left by retreating wrongs. No one could see an aging black woman alone on the street and think her harmless anymore. Clarice had turned suspicion into awakening, and she needed no praise to sustain that truth. A group of high school students passed by, some recognizing her, whispering without noise. They saw her as an anchor in the city's flow. No explanation needed. They knew who Clarice was, and their silence was how the city learned respect. At the top of the small hill leading to a quiet neighborhood, Clarice stopped. The afternoon light fell over her shoulder, casting long shadows on the stone ground. Punch from years ago no longer marked her face. It had transformed into something that made others slow down whenever they tried to cross a line. The fall from that year did not break her. It became a milestone that made the whole system step back and look. Clarice looked up at the sky. No clouds, no wind, yet the light was enough to show that the humblest wounds could cast the longest rays. She stepped forward, each step light as if leaving no sound, yet every step echoed all that had ever denied the value of calm. And along that street no one asked further questions. No one needed more proof. There was only her figure, clear, alone, and unyielding. She never needed to shout to change anyone, because in the end, what made others stop was a steady gaze, without a single siren. Clarice Hargrove is not a symbol created by slogans. She is not the product of a campaign, nor does she belong to any trend. Her story began in silence, hit its lowest point with the punch of a sergeant, and ended with the bowing of an entire system. Not because she demanded it, but because everything around her could no longer avoid the consequences of neglect left too long. Clarice passed through that event like someone walking through fire, unburned, yet leaving the smell of smoke in the memory of the one who struck the match. From a normal morning when a black woman in her 60s was stopped just for walking slowly through the downtown area, to the moment a middle-aged police officer's angry fist struck her cheek in front of dozens, Clarice maintained her stance. She did not push back or lower her voice. She looked straight ahead, and it was that gaze that cracked the thick shell of abuse of power. Sergeant Nolan Briggs failed not only because he hit a federal agent by mistake, but because he did not realize that this woman carried the patience of many generations who had been beaten without anyone filming, bleeding without anyone recording it. Clarice did not use her badge to appear on television, nor grasp her pain to demand praise. She did only one thing: move forward, so everyone could see that the victim could also become the one who restored balance. Through her presence, the whole case gradually revealed deeper pieces. Old victims began to speak out. Courts could no longer ignore the truth. Young officers dared to stand up in meetings, refusing to protect organized silence. One name once listed among commendations was permanently erased. Another name, without medals, appeared as a principal in training manuals. And then, that very story became teaching material, not to glorify but to remind future trainees that behind every reckless decision, there might be a silent Clarice watching, because the danger of power does not lie in rank, but in how it is used when no one is watching. Clarice did not ask to be heard, but her silence forced everyone to listen. From the solitary act of a racist officer to a sweeping internal investigation, the case became a turning point, not because it shocked, but because it was undeniable. The evidence was in the video, unedited, uncut. More than that, it happened in broad daylight, in the city, among those who had once turned their faces away. The shamelessness could no longer hide behind badges. The weakness of law enforcement was exposed in every denial, and Clarice, though she fell, made the system stop. But the greatest lesson is not in the verdicts. It is in Clarice's choice to refuse power, reject rewards, and decline the spotlight. While others invited her to step up, she chose to step back, not from exhaustion, but because she understood that she did not need to occupy a seat in the old structure to force its change. Her presence alone made that empty chair heavier than anyone who dared to sit in it. The girl who live-streamed that day became a symbol of a generation that knows how to respond. The guard, named Jerome, became a situational training instructor elsewhere. Officials who had turned away now accept rewriting procedures, and somewhere in a dispatch room corner, the phrase, "Clarice still stands," remains untouched, not because it matters, but because no one dares to forget. That story shows justice does not start in court. It starts with reflex, the citizen who live streams, the witness who shouts, the child who asks if she is still an agent. Most importantly, it begins when the one who was beaten chooses to move forward, not become a vengeful person. Clarice chose the harder path, silent forgiveness, that leaves a clear consequence for every wrongful strike. In a city once used to bowing to sirens, Clarice taught people to look up. In a system used to ignoring wrongdoing, she taught them to take responsibility. And in each of us reading this story, she leaves a question. If you had stood there that day, would you look away or be the first to say, stop? Without titles, Clarice leaves a lesson. True power is not in authority, but in knowing when to step back so others see their wrong. That is a power that many in high positions never touch in a lifetime. She still walks every morning, still chooses the old sidewalk, still keeps the same stride. But all of us, whether familiar or strangers, have changed since the days she was hit and did not fall. And that, whether history records it or not, remains a victory. If you are still watching until now, perhaps this story has touched something within you. Because this is not just Clarice Hargrove's story, it is the story of those forced into silence, of gazes dismissed, of punches thought unseen, but this time the whole world saw. And if you ever thought that only those with great power can change anything, remember, she simply stood up, and every step she took made the entire system pause. So, if tomorrow you witness something wrong, do not look away. If you see someone insulted because of their skin color, age, or status, do not stay silent. You don't need to be an agent, you just need to be someone who dares to look injustice in the eye. Share this story, not to spread pain, but to plant what is right. Because one punch can make someone fall, but one calm, timely gaze can make an entire city change.